Welcome back, everyone. I'm Robin from This Blog's Neat, and I guess I'm also now Robin from Rum et al. Last week, I introduced you to my rum company, Rum et al., and my first batch of rum, Baseline, and today I'm going to tell you exactly how I made it. If you didn't catch the video of me doing that introduction, I recommend checking it out. But some of you have ordered Baseline, thank you so much, and have already gotten your bottles, and please let me know what you think of it. But I wanted to tell you exactly how Baseline was made. Now, if you have watched this video, you'll know the exact recipe that I used, but I do want to give you guys like the exact numbers for everything for how I made Baseline. Now, if you have the bottle, you can read on the back exactly what went into making it. And if you head over to my website, you can also check out all that information there. But I wanted to do a video about it and to include some of the footage that I got during the production process of making Baseline. And if you have any questions at all, please let me know. But I'm hoping that I'm going to be thorough enough in this video that it just answers all of your questions. Yeah, I will be sipping on Baseline as I do this video. So being that Baseline is my first batch, the whole goal of this batch was to be pretty straightforward, right? Not super funky. It's just molasses, water, and yeast that's in the fermentation. And then it's double pot distilled and bottled completely unaged without any additives at all, except for water if you got the 49% ABV version. So yeah, let's start with talking about the fermentation. So the full batch size was 150 gallons. And I started it by adding 120 gallons of hot water. It was LA tap water, into a 300-gallon IBC tote, just a standard tote that you'll see at most distilleries. I then mixed in one 5-gallon bucket at a time, 30 gallons of baking grade molasses. Now, I got this baking grade molasses from Golden Barrel, and I got 5-gallon buckets because we don't have a molasses pump, so I was actually dumping in 5 gallons of molasses at a time, trying not to spill it everywhere into the tote. Here are the specs of the molasses. Now, one really, really important thing that I've emphasized in other videos is that you want to get molasses that is unsulfured, that does not have sulfur added. Sulfur is put in molasses to prevent spoilage, and you actually want spoilage to be able to happen because fermentation is a controlled form of spoilage, essentially. So yeah, a little note that I like to throw out there, and I will continue to emphasize this in probably every video when I talk about molasses. So once I added in the 30 gallons of molasses, I then mixed it with a tote mixer, which was so cool. I thought I was gonna have to, stir everything by hand, but Erin at Dead of Night has a tote mixer, a mechanical tote mixer, and that just got to work mixing everything up. Then I took the starting specific gravity and the starting temperature, which was 1.082 at 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, with the temperature correction, the starting specific gravity was actually 1.088. Then I added good old Red Star distiller's yeast. Yeah, went for the standard distiller's yeast. I added 12 ounces of that, and 12 ounces, I didn't weigh it, I measured it, so 12 fluid ounces. Is that a cup and a half? And as I mentioned, the total batch size was 150 gallons. So I let that get going on its own. I let it start fermenting. After about a day, it started to build up a little bit of activity. And then after 2 days, I added in nutrients. These are the nutrients that I added in. It's your standard Fermax, BSG nutrients. And by that time, the fermentation was nice and active. I added a cup and a half, which was less than what was actually prescribed on the bag, but that's all I had. This is what is included in those nutrients, and this is what I should have added if I followed what was suggested on the bag, but I didn't. So now after a couple of days, once everything was nice and active, I also took a specific gravity reading just to see where we were going, and it was down to 1.080, so still a long ways to go. A week later, the specific gravity was down to about 1.024, so still a little bit to go, and it was still very active. And then a week after that, the specific gravity was down to 1.005. That would put the wash at about 10.9% ABV. And the following day, I did a stripping run. Now, keep in mind, the batch size of the fermenter was 150 gallons, but the still I was using was only able to hold 55 gallons at a time. So I split this into 3 stripping runs. The first stripping run I did after the fermentation had been going for 16 days. The second stripping run I did after 17 days. And then the third stripping run, because there was a weekend here, the third stripping run was done after the fermentation had been going for 22 days. So you'll notice on your bottle or on my website that the fermentation duration does go from 16 to 22 days. And that's where that variation comes in. That's where that range comes in. Now, the first low wines distillation yielded about 17 gallons at around 31% ABV. The second low wines was at about 15 gallons at about 32% ABV. And then the third low wines distillation was at about 18 gallons at about, actually, I didn't take the ABV reading for that batch. But in total, that got me about 50 gallons at 29% ABV. So this is a little bit lower than I would normally go. I normally aim for 30 to 35% ABV, but I do remember that on that third low wines distillation, I just kept running it because I was socializing with Mary, the distiller at Lost Spirits. She had come to the distillery for that distillation, and we were chit-chatting and catching up and stuff, and so I just let the still run. Oh, I will note the way that I had the still set up was a pot distillation with no plates in the column at all, but I did have 3 sight glasses in the neck, and that was because I needed that much height because of the condenser and the parrot situation. So that's how I had it set up for both the low wines distillations or the stripping runs and the spirit run. Now, for the spirit run, I collected several different cuts. The first cut I collected was the first stuff that came off the still, the 4 shots, and I collected about 2 gallons of 4 shots, and those were at about 81% ABV. After that, things started to taste a little bit better, a little bit fruitier, but I still was not super certain if we were in the heads or the hearts yet. So I collected about 1 3/4 of a gallon of heads at around 79% ABV. And I keep saying around because I did like rough temperature corrections for the alcohol hydrometer that I was using. After that, everything was tasting like we were good. We were well into the hearts, and I knew it. So I collected 9 gallons of hearts, which was pretty great. I was happy with that. But then I started to taste, when I taste tails, I tend to call them noodly. Like they remind me of pasta water. And I know that's not what everyone gets. For me, I think tails start to get like, yeah, noodly is the best way, is the way that I describe it. But for me, it's almost like a pasta water thing, like a grungy pasta water. So around this time, I switched over to collecting what I was calling maybes. I was getting butterscotch and fruits, but also just like little bits of noodliness. So I collected 1 3/4 gallons of these maybes. Then it started getting a little bit grungier, a little bit more noodly, and I collected 3 gallons of what I called maybe nots. Those were still at around like 67% ABV, but I just wasn't certain. And if this was going to be a spirit that I would age, I would have collected a little bit farther into the tails. Those flavors end up being able to develop when you are aging a spirit. So sometimes you can go a little bit deeper into the tails when your spirit's going to be aged, because time and, maturation will do its magic and transform those flavors so they won't taste too much like noodles anymore. And then after that, I was definitely in the tails, but I collected like 2.5 gallons of tails, and I stopped collecting when it was tasting like straight noodles. Pasta water. Now, what I ended up keeping and tossing into baseline right here is the heads. I ended up keeping the heads. I really liked the flavors that were in there. I kept, obviously, the hearts, and I kept the maybes, but I did go through a couple days of playing around with and tasting the maybe nots to see, like, okay, do I want to toss in these maybe nots, these like still fruity, still sweet, still butterscotchy, but has a little bit of that grunginess. I really wanted to see if that would add to the rum. Tasting them on their own, they smelled fruity, but also tailsy. And I will quote myself here. I was getting hot backpack grapes as a teenager. I was not the best at cleaning out my backpack. And I remember very specifically having grapes that were in my backpack for too long, got squished, started fermenting. So when I say hot backpack grapes, it's like tastes fermented, but not in the best way. The maybe nots also tasted fruity, but I was getting a little bit of bitterness. It was almost reminding me of like a burnt pasta water and burnt prunes. So I did make a little bit of a tincture and blended together what I was keeping, the spirit that I was keeping, with a little bit of the maybe nots. And I just felt that the maybe nots weren't bringing the right flavors to the picture. However, I have kept the maybe nots, the tails, even the foreshots for redistilling in the future. Might we see a queen share? I don't know. Anyways, so I also got chemical analysis done on the spirit. And if you watched this video, or maybe it's this video, I actually show you the results of that chemical analysis for baseline. Again, the full congener breakdown is over on my website. And in this video, I show you how to convert from ppm to grams per hectoliter of pure alcohol. And I made an assumption when doing those calculations. I assumed that the way that the GCMS was calibrated for these results was based on volume to volume, right? Parts per million is a little bit up to interpretation, right? It's parts per million parts. So those parts can be liters per million liters. They can be grams per million grams. But what I should have done, instead of making an assumption, is I should have just asked White Labs, which is the lab that I use to do this chemical analysis, what their standards were. How do they define ppm? And the way that they define ppm would have made these calculations a whole lot simpler. And I feel like that's always the case whenever I make assumptions. I just make my life harder. They define ppm as 1 milligram per liter. So I was already in weight per volume. So converting from weight per volume, ppm, to grams per hectoliter of pure alcohol, which is also weight to volume, was a lot more straightforward. And here are the results. I would not consider this a high ester rum by any means. As you can see, the amount of esters is very, very, very low. The quantity of esters is pretty low. And now what I have listed is everything that was tested by White Labs. So is it possible that there are some other esters in here that weren't tested? Maybe. But Ethyl acetate is the predominant ester that you find in all distilled spirits. There's not going to be another ester that's in here that's going to exceed the ethyl acetate. And at 8.5 grams per hectoliter of pure alcohol, like, that's pretty low. But there are a lot of fusel alcohols, and fusel alcohols tend to be alcoholic. They can be sweet, fruity. They can be pungent as well, maybe a little musty too. So I'm excited to have the chemical analysis and to be able to compare the chemical analysis with future batches as well. Okay, now, maybe you got a bottle of baseline at still strength, or maybe you got a bottle of baseline at 49% ABV, the proofed down version. And when I was proofing down the spirit, I did consider, a few different proofs to kind of look at. I was seeing how water impacted the flavor profile. So of course I tasted this at still strength, 75% ABV. And for me, I get a lot of these like dried fruits, lots of raisins, cheese Danish, cinnamon, as well as like some grapefruit and cacao nibs on the palate. So this is the flavor profile that I'm starting with. And at 75% ABV, I was very happy with that flavor profile. So I tried proofing it down at kind of your standard white overproof at like 63% ABV. And weirdly, it tasted watered down. It was kind of just like sweet and not super complex. I also considered 56, and that's because 56 was somewhere between 63 and 49. 49 was kind of the lowest I wanted to go. And that's because as a rum consumer, I kind of look for something that's at 50% or above, right? I get a little bit sad when I see spirits that are bottled at 40% ABV, 42, 43, 46 is better. But yeah, it's, I'm kind of hoping for something closer to that 50% ABV. So I thought, okay, 49 is probably as low as I'm going to want to go. So I tasted it at 49 and was very pleasantly surprised. I thought it did have a lot of complexity. This is not me just like selling the proof that I chose, by the way. I was actually happy with this proof that I chose. And I was getting, more complexity than I was with the 56 and the 63% ABV. So that's what I went with. And if you're one of my Patreons, you'll know that there might be a little bit more to the story of 49% ABV involving taxes in California. And if you want to dive into that, like, let me know. I'm more than happy to, talk about alcohol taxes. Do we want to talk about label design too? I briefly mentioned label design in this video, but when I was designing the label, I did want it to be fun and feminine while also being scientific. Science can be fun, which is why I went with the bright colors. And of course I chose colors that I loved, but the background here is an actual microscopic image of the fermentation. So you can see the yeast, you can see a little bit of specks of bacteria that are in there. And then the back is modeled after my actual lab notebook. This is what my lab notebook actually looks like. So that's where I went with label design, and I designed the label myself. Now, bottling was fun. My friend Mary, the distiller at Lost Spirits, she came out and helped me bottle, and we bottled everything by hand. That was definitely a choice that we made. But we started with bottling the still strength. And then with the remaining spirit that was left over, I then added water. Now the water that I used was just RO water. We have an RO filter at Dead of Night Distillery. And that's the water that I used to proof it down to 49%. And then we bottled everything that was left into the 750 ml bottles designated for the 49% ABV spirit. That's it. Yeah, I think that's everything. I will mention that I also kept the dunder from all 3 of the stripping runs that I did. And that dunder very quickly started to form a beautiful pellicle layer on top. So yeah, I'm excited to use the dunder for future batches. And let me know if you have any questions at all. Like I said, I'm an open book. Rum et al. Is all about transparency, and I don't want you guys to feel like I'm withholding any information from you or trying to create silly stories just to sell my rum to you. Yeah, and before I go, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreons. Thank you guys so much for helping to support the channel. And if you, the viewer, would also like to support the channel beyond just your normal YouTube things, then I've got a link in the description below where you can join us over there. Now, you've been able to purchase the bottles for a week now, and there are still some left. So if you're interested in picking up a bottle or 2 and supporting this project that I'm working on, I've got links in the description below, but you can head over to my website, which is rumatelier.com, and that will link you to deadofnightdistillery.com, or you can head directly over to deadofnightdistillery.com to purchase bottles. Yeah, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed the content that I create, please subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up, watch more of my videos, share it with your friends that you think would also enjoy it, and yeah, leave me comments. Let me know if you have any questions at all.